Yep.
Right, there's a pumpkin and a walrus. So it's a couple minutes past 3 here on the East Coast, and so I think it's time to begin. So I'm Jonathan Bagger. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the American Physical Society, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on state-level anti-DEI legislation across the country. And I am especially pleased today that this event was jointly organized by the American Physical Society, the American Association of Physics Teachers, and the National Society of Black Physicists. Diversity is a core value for each of our societies, and we know that many of our members are concerned how the new laws and policies that are coming into place across the country might affect their classrooms, their research, and their other activities. So I'm joined by Beth Cunningham, the CEO of AAPT, and Hakeem Oluseyi, president of NSBP. Hakeem will introduce today's speaker, and Beth will provide final remarks to close out the webinar. And I'll return to moderate the question and answers following our guest speaker's presentation. But for now, I turn the microphone over to Hakeem.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's my honor to introduce Jeremy Young. Jeremy is the Freedom to Learn Program Director at PEN America. And so PEN America is a 101-year-old organization that is focused around freedom of expression. In his role, Jeremy leads PEN America's efforts to fight the government censorship in educational institutions with a particular focus on the higher education sector, which makes him ideal for what we've asked him to do. He directs PEN America's work on educational gag orders, the Champions of Higher Education Initiative, and an expanding network of coalitions to mobilize support for professors and teachers. Jeremy holds a PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University and is the author of The Age of Charisma: Leaders, Followers, and Emotions in American Society, 1870-1940. He was a 2021 New Leaders Council Fellow and a recipient of the Roger D. Bridges Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Progressive Era. Without further ado, Jeremy, take it away, sir.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I appreciate everyone on this call and the organizations for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm not going to take too much of your time. I want to go through some background information here on on the legislation that we're here to discuss. Let me share my screen. And while I'm doing that, just one moment, make sure I'm on the right tab. Okay. I do want to apologize in advance for cannot possibly live up to the charisma of the title of my book in this presentation. So you'll have to forgive me for that. In any case, we're here to talk about anti-DEI legislation across the U.S. And I want to give you a sort of landscape analysis of what this legislation is doing, where we see it across the country, what impact it may have on the sciences on both the high school and college level, and what we're seeing as some of the risks going forward, as well as some of the opportunities, and how we encourage folks to respond to this kind of legislation as well. So just a little bit about PEN America. As was mentioned, we're a 100-year-old literary and human rights organization that advocates for free expression in the United States and the world. For the last 7 years, PEN America has had a free expression and education program, a program that was originally founded to focus on the need for a sort of harmonization of diversity and inclusion goals on college campuses with robust free expression protections. PEN America does not see these as opposed to one another, but we do see, there being folks on all sides of these issues who see them as unnecessarily opposed. And so our goal is to advocate for how these ideas can be woven together. To that end, we have a campus free speech guide, a set of principles of campus free speech, a series of reports like the one you see on the left side of your screen, a series of trainings, Campus for All trainings. We will actually come to your campus and offer training programs on free expression for staff and faculty and students and administrators. We also run a series of advocacy institutes for youth, both high school and college students. In the last couple of years, we've expanded more into an advocacy venue through two vehicles. First, the Freedom to Read program, probably our most publicly known program at the moment, which focuses on combating book bans in districts around the country, school book bans in school libraries. And finally, the Freedom to Learn program, which I direct, which is our program focusing on state-level legislation affecting both K-12 and higher education, but specifically higher education from a censorious or a chilling perspective. So for the last couple of years, PEN America has been particularly concerned with what we term educational gag orders. You may have heard of these bills as so-called divisive concepts or anti-critical race theory bills. These are state-level threats to the freedom to learn and teach. What do these bills do? They typically ban, list a sort of series of so-called divisive concepts relating to race, gender, or identity. They ban either compelling adherence to those concepts, or promoting those concepts, or including those concepts in a class. Even mentioning those concepts in some bills could violate these laws. Why does PEN America care about these as a free expression organization? We care about them, we're concerned about them because for a few reasons. Because they impose content and viewpoint-based censorship. To be clear, it is legal and actually not just legal, but perfectly fine to ban teachers from telling everyone that the classroom is about to burn down and they should all stampede to the back of the room as quickly as they can and trample each other. That's illegal because it's legal to ban that because that is not a content or viewpoint-based ban. It's simply based on safety. It's based on the proper functioning of the university. These bills are different. They restrict classroom instruction on the basis of basically viewpoint. What do you think about a particular issue related to these topics? They also are incredibly vaguely written. They ban everything and nothing all at once, and in doing so, they lead inevitably to both administrative censorship by administrators of faculty when the administrators are concerned that they will be targeted for allowing something, and self-censorship where faculty and sometimes students censor themselves to avoid running afoul of the law. Of course, these bills do also suppress the visibility and voices of particular groups, especially Black and LGBTQ voices. The bills we're talking about, these educational gag orders, they've only been around for about 3 years, and they really grow out of the moment in the summer of 2020 when there appeared to be a sort of racial reckoning going on in the United States. The George Floyd protests, the popularity of the 1619 Project and other materials. And as a result of this moment, there was what has increasingly been termed as sort of equity backlash against these developments. And this manifested initially as a set of deliberate efforts to use the term critical race theory as a catch-all term for certain educational practices related to DEI or race or gender or identity. In September of 2020, President Trump issued an executive order called Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping that for the first time listed this set of 9 divisive concepts, which were banned from trainings in government agencies, federal agencies. The executive order never went into effect. It was immediately stayed by a court and repealed on the first day of the Biden administration. But we soon began to see that language from that executive order migrating into state-level legislation, and at this time, not legislation aimed at, aimed at sort of trainings and agencies, but aimed instead at K-12 schools and increasingly at higher education institutions as well. So this moved from being a prohibition on trainings to a prohibition on educational practices in the classroom. We saw about over 50 of these bills appear in 2021, and then with the surprise come from behind victory of Glenn Youngkin in the Virginia governor's race in November of that year, running on a platform focused on these issues, there was a significant acceleration in 2022, nearly 150 bills of this type proposed. And while the number has been slightly lower in 2023, it's still significantly higher than it was in 2021. Just throw this up here for a second. We don't really have time to go over these, but this is the list of so-called divisive concepts laid out by laid out in the executive order, the initial version of this. As you'll see, these are principles that read like a caricature of what someone might think critical race theory is, but not actual critical race theory. They don't really, critical race theory does not in fact suggest that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, and so on. The effect of these prohibitions, however, because they don't really correspond to actual practice of what's taught in the classroom, is that they have a certain vagueness where they could be interpreted or overinterpreted by certain government agencies as pertaining to all sorts of things that are in fact taught in the classroom. For instance, as we'll talk about in a bit, this question of whether something is fundamentally or inherently racist or sexist could prohibit the discussion of, for instance, racial statistics showing racial disparities in hiring or medicine or in criminal prosecution. You could say, well, those statistics suggest that the institution is fundamentally racist, therefore we can't show the statistics. And we have in fact seen instances of this being prohibited, although not many of them. The example here of members of no one should receive adverse treatment solely because of his or her race or sex. This has been interpreted in some places as banning the mere discussion of affirmative action or reparations, not advocating for those things, but banning even mentioning that they exist or that they are ideas that some people hold or support. So it is a very vague and strange list of prohibitions, which have ultimately a broad chilling effect on classrooms and campuses around the country. Some of the restrictions that we've seen, or that have been suggested, some of these have happened, others are mere suggestions that could come out of these prohibitions, specifically in the higher ed space. Obviously, history, literature, gender and ethnic studies programs, critical race theory in a law school. These are the obvious prohibitions. But we see these in other places as well. Education departments in colleges have been very heavily affected by these prohibitions because even K-12 restrictions end up restricting the curricula in teacher training programs at the college level. Discussion of affirmative action or reparations could affect political science, medicine. There could be restrictions on teaching of abortion related to these or other laws related to speech in the classroom. Disparities in employment practices, statistics on race and gender, university recognition or funding for some student groups. There are versions of these laws that prohibit the division or classification of students by race, which could prohibit the funding of the Black Student Union or some group of African American or other racial minority in a particular department. Some content and DEI trainings or public lectures could be prohibited by these bills. There are potential risks here for university accreditation, particularly in the context of there being undue influence applied by politicians on boards of trustees and boards of governors, which are supposed to make these decisions for their campuses. And above all, there is a chilling effect. Again, these laws are rarely enforced, particularly at the college level. They instead serve to scare people out of touching these issues at all. A couple of maps about these laws. Here's the higher ed map, first of all, the less scary of the two, but still fairly scary. Almost 100 of these bills have been proposed in the last 3 years in 33 states. 13 have become law in 9 states, affecting 73 million Americans. This includes one bill in Texas. From the next category of bills we're going to discuss, the rest of these are educational gag orders. Higher ed, the map is far bleaker. 45 states in higher ed have seen one of these bills introduced. 20 states have seen it enacted either by law or policy. And these K-12 bills have a significant impact on higher education as well. They impact teacher training programs, student teaching. We've seen student teachers pulled out of school districts because of ways that these laws have been, or at the district level policies have been implemented. Continuing education programs for teachers. We've seen instances of these being censored in some way, even if they involve, faculty or some sort of higher ed component. Threats to concurrent enrollment and other early college credit programs. I used to give this presentation last year and warn that AP courses could be censored by these laws. And unfortunately, that warning came to pass. We've seen that happen in Florida and some suggestions that it will happen in other states as well. There is, and ultimately the issue here is at the higher ed level for these K-12 gag orders is a limitation of student preparation for college. We describe these laws as really restrictions on democracy because ultimately they deprive students of knowledge at both the K-12 and the higher ed level, knowledge that is vital for their understanding of the world around them, of their fellow Americans, of the society in which they live. And as those students grow up and become, adults and leaders and voters, they will lack the sort of social education and civic education about their society that they need in order to be informed citizens. So it really is an undermining of democracy in addition to the effect on educational institutions themselves. Now, in 2023, in the legislative sessions that have mostly concluded, we have seen a sort of new shift here. In the K-12 space, actually, there was a shift away from race-focused restrictions, although there were still a few new ones, and a shift instead to more LGBTQ-focused restrictions. The Don't Say Gay bill, which stood almost alone in 2022, had many copycats in 2023, several of which passed. At the higher ed level, we've seen a different kind of shift, a shift toward what have been publicly referred to as DEI bans or restrictions on not on classroom instruction, but on whether a university can have a DEI office or initiative or anything resembling a DEI office or initiative. In fact, these restrictions generally go much further, although the two of these have become law, several others were proposed. Texas, one of the ones that's become law, Texas SB 17, is fairly narrowly tailored around actually banning DEI offices as it claims to. But that was the result of several rounds of editing and amendments in the legislature that brought it down from a much more draconian bill, which is actually what passed in Florida, a much more draconian version of this, which goes far beyond diversity offices in particular to restrict governance within universities. The idea being essentially that many universities have chosen to invest in diversity and inclusion programs, and therefore they cannot be trusted to make choices about their own operations or governance. So this Florida law we have seen, includes restrictions that give political appointees control over core curricula and general education courses in Florida universities, rewriting universities' mission statements every 3 years by political appointees, banning general education courses that distort historical events in giant air quotes because there's no definition provided of what that means. There are restrictions on accreditation in these bills, making it more difficult for accreditors to enforce DEI policies or standards at universities. And in Ohio, a bill of this type came very close to passing that would have included a number of additional prohibitions, including restriction on any university official of offering a position on a set of so-called political issues, which were so broad as to include inclusion, sustainability, or marriage, as well as potential penalties for students who were found to have violated the, quote, intellectual diversity rights of anyone on campus relating to these issues. So, this bill didn't become law, but it came within a whisker of becoming law in June. It is still live in Ohio. It may be passed later this year or next year. So what do we expect to see coming in 2024? More of these restrictions on higher education institutions' autonomy, DEI bans, restrictions on accreditation, on curriculum and general education, restrictions on tenure, hiring, and firing. Some of these, none of these actually became law in 2023, but there were a number of particularly concerning ones, including a bill in Texas that would have ended all tenure for new hires, and a bill in blanking on the other state, but Florida. The one version of the bill in Florida would have allowed the president of the university to hire anyone for any job without consulting with anyone else at the university, whether or not that person was qualified or had applied for the job. Again, these didn't become law, but we expect to see them, coming forward again. We also expect to see more serious attempts to ban gender studies. This has already been done at New College of Florida, a single college that has been sort of taken over by a set of politically motivated trustees. But it was proposed in one version of the Florida law, SB 266, and has also been proposed in Wyoming over each of the last 2 years. So we expect to see a more serious push in this direction going forward. New states will be targeted. Arkansas, Louisiana, Ohio are clear targets. There will probably be others. And of course, in the both of the leading candidates for the presidential election of one major party have made this issue a centerpiece of their campaign. So we expect to see this become much more of a national dialogue rather than targeted to specific states in the coming year. I wanted to pull out some of the potential impacts on sciences here. There's some, again, it's tough to answer this question, what the specific impact of these laws are on anyone, really, because they are so vaguely written. And even in the case of the DEI bans, which are more specific in some ways, it's not always clear how they define a DEI office or a DEI initiative. Even in the Texas bill, where serious attempts were made to define it more clearly, it's still not quite there to the point where you can know exactly what is or is not a DEI office. So educational gag orders, the category of bills that passed in 2021 and 2022, these bills limit discussions of, potential discussions of racial disparities, of cultural competence, of differential impact within science fields, scientific fields, medical fields. Again, these bills are rarely directly enforced. I can't think of a single instance where a bill like this has been enforced at the curricular level in a science course. In fact, only 2 instances where it was enforced in any course at the curricular level, and both of those were enforced administratively. So there's no example of a government official going after a college course around these bills. We really do say that vagueness is the point on this legislation. It is designed to be vague. It's designed to cause you to self-enforce rather than to follow the direction of the law. The DEI bans are a little more specific and a little more concerning, I think, for the sciences. They limit formal DEI programs or initiatives. I should clarify, these bans are only enforced in Texas and Florida right now. The other ones proposed in other states did not pass. You will hear discussions of DEI restrictions that passed in other states, but those restrictions were focused specifically on mandatory diversity statements, something that I think in the hiring process, something that I think is a fairly minor concern for programs compared to this. These bans, particularly in Texas, they may limit language and methodologies that can be used in securing grants. There is significant concern about this in Texas. There is a carve out for some of this in the Florida bill, but not as much. There may be a limitation on the use of state funds for particular initiatives, which doesn't necessarily mean those initiatives, you can't participate in those initiatives if they are funded from outside or from an organization. But really, these laws are very new. They've only been enforced for a couple of months in these 2 states where they exist. And it's really hard to tell how they're going to be interpreted or enforced. So far, what we're seeing is fairly significant interpretation and censorship coming from university administrations, which are very concerned about running afoul of them. We have not seen any instances yet of direct enforcement by the state. Finally, in high school, for those who work with high school students, some of these, it's kind of, you can have both of these policies. We haven't seen a high school focused DEI restriction. The educational gag orders are widespread. As I said, 20 states have some version of this on the law, on the books now. There are also district level restrictions on DEI initiatives in school districts, which may be more impactful than some of the state regulations. So, where is this coming from? What is the underlying problem here? The truth is that current teaching about these issues is broadly popular, and it is stubbornly popular, despite the onslaught of hundreds of millions of dollars at this point of negative earned media advertising, not paid advertising, but just attacks in the media against these kind of programs. They remain broadly popular. The sort of on the educational gag orders front, 75% of all Americans, including the large majorities of Republicans, say in poll after poll that they support the teaching of issues around race and slavery and racism, even if it makes students uncomfortable. There was also a poll that YouGov did earlier this year that asked specifically about public support for DEI in its acronym form, which is typically the form that would generate the least amount of support. And it showed broad support across the public, kind of a confounding result. It also showed that a lot of Americans are not really aware of what DEI is. So it has not really been fixed in the public mind in quite the way that CRT has at this point. What we see, on the other hand, is, first of all, a major drop-off on the higher ed side of conservative views of higher ed. And I want to stress that this is not, the polls show that this is a drop-off on conservative views of higher ed as a sector. It does not seem to apply to individual institutions, or whether someone values their own degree or thinks their child should go to college, or how they feel about their child's professors. It really affects a sort of nebulous idea of what higher ed means that has become unpopular. And there is also an intensity gap. While the majority of Americans do support higher ed and do support these practices, they do not necessarily see it as their top issue in the way that the minority of critics do seem to see it. So higher education has been doing a number of things here. There's a whole list of statements that PEN America and other organizations have been involved in. And it's not just statements. There's organizing going on. There are initiatives like our Champions of Higher Education initiative with 235 former college presidents and system heads who in every state of the country who have been speaking and writing against these bills. And a number of higher ed organizations have been involved in this as well. Really, hundreds of groups at this point have weighed in at some level. And there are also has been, maybe more effectively, frankly, a sort of legal response to these bills, particularly to the educational gag orders, which have now been around long enough for lawsuits to be prepared and to be successful. 2 lawsuits have been temporarily successful, both against the Stop Woke Act in Florida, one of the most censorious of the educational gag orders. First, Honey Fund v. DeSantis, which has resulted in a temporary stay on the portion of that law that restricted education in private institutions. That was restricted, ruled unconstitutional by a judge. We'll see how that goes through the court system. And then a similar stay issued toward in these 2 cases, Purnell v. Lamb and Novoa v. Diaz, which have been combined into one case, a stay issued on the higher ed portion of this act entirely. So in Florida, the K-12 portion of this act is the only part still in force. There is another higher ed lawsuit still pending, Burt v. O'Connor in Oklahoma. This lawsuit's moving very slowly. And then in Florida, 2 new lawsuits have been filed against SB 266, the higher ed autonomy restriction and DEI ban that passed this year. Brash v. Lamb, filed by the state faculty union, and NCF Freedom v. Diaz, filed by a small group of advocates around New College of Florida. So, I want to close here by focusing on what we recommend in these situations. How do you deal with this happening in higher education and K-12? I like to divide this up by role. I think most of us have 3 roles that we inhabit simultaneously that are relevant to this. We are educators, we're citizens outside of our role as teachers and faculty members, and we are professionals. We work in a sort of professional community. So, as educators, the number one focus is on this is don't do the censor's work for them. You don't. These laws are vague. They prohibit very little, and they suggest prohibitions of a lot. And what that means is there is an enormous temptation. These laws use prudence and risk management against you, right? Most of the time, those are very, very good things. But these laws encourage you to, just to be safe, censor yourself, censor others around even touching on issues of race, gender, or identity. We strongly discourage this, right? We're not telling anyone to break the law. In fact, quite the opposite. No one should break the law. But it's very unclear what these bills prohibit, and you really should not be prohibiting things yourself because you are afraid that the law will be enforced in that way. I always tell people, wait for someone to actually tell you something is banned before you act as though it's banned. Otherwise, you are essentially magnifying the effect of the law in your own classroom, in your own programs. And then you are doing the work of the censors for them. So that's the number one guidance. We encourage faculty to support one another, to support students, to maintain and enrich as much of this programming as they can, to defend and to defend it largely through a focus on mission and disciplinary standards. Right, this is the strong place, the solid ground to stand on in higher education. It's not just your opinion whether something, or even your training whether something is a good idea. It is the standards of the discipline that require a particular approach or topic. It is in some cases the mission of the institution itself that requires these things. As citizens, as I said, this intensity gap where there are a lot of people who think that these restrictions are a bad idea, but don't necessarily care enough or feel strongly enough to really be motivated on them or to move on them. The solution to this is publicity. Anyone who is in a position, and many are not, but anyone who is in a position to speak publicly on this without repercussion should do so. And again, I want to stress, many of you are not in that position, and you should make that determination for yourself. But if you do feel that you are in a safe spot, talk about this, make it clear that what is happening and how this is affecting educational institutions. And finally, as professionals, we really encourage you not to go it alone. These kind of restrictions can be really isolating. They can be really limiting. And the solution here is to work with people in your discipline, people in your institution, people across the country who are really concerned about these issues and who want to support one another. Whole sector solidarity. One of the things that is remarkable about this moment in higher education is that these laws affect all elements of higher education institutions pretty much equally. They restrict faculty speech, and they also restrict administrators' right to make decisions for themselves, and students' right to learn. They're really an alumni, experience and connection to their school. So there is an opportunity here for unprecedented unity and coalition building within higher education and collective action. And we really encourage folks to engage in that where possible. There has been some polling on this, how to respond, what arguments to make if you are making an argument about these laws. The polls have found that the our argument at PEN America that the legislation has a chilling effect on free speech in the classroom. That is the second most popular argument nationally. The most popular argument, however, is simply this, that the government has no business telling teachers what they can and cannot teach. Now, I want to be careful about this because the poll also showed that our weakest argument is that the taxpayers have no business telling teachers what they can and cannot teach. So, there is a sense among many Americans that they themselves would like to be able to walk into a classroom and tell someone what they can't teach. But when they recognize that that's impractical, and what would actually happen with these regulations is that the government would make these decisions for everyone. That is where they get off the train. So that argument is particularly compelling. So one poll we saw showed 70% of Americans agreed with that statement. So that's all I have to kick this off. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'd love to talk about specific states or specific scenarios, anything where I can offer guidance. And again, I really appreciate your time and the invitation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much for that really very compelling presentation. I am sure that we have questions coming in over the Q&A. We've had some submitted in advance, some came in while you were talking. And so I'd like to start with one that's just very close to home. All three of our organizations have DEI programs that engage many of our members. And so the question is asked, is participating in one of these programs sponsored by one of our organizations, is participating on one of these programs okay?
It's a very tough question. It's a tougher question than it sounds, and it's a question that I can only answer in part because some of it is a legal question. What I will say is, I do not see any reason that participating in a program of the type described, unless you are in one of the two states with DEI bans, Texas or Florida, would be banned. I don't see this as a close case when it comes to educational gag order type restrictions. In Texas and Florida, it really depends. I think that's a question, and it depends on whether the law is being interpreted to restrict use of state funds, which is not necessarily relevant here if the institution, if the associations are funding the program, or whether it's participation at all. My general sense is that it might be the former, and that participation might be fine. But I would seek additional guidance on that. And I know that specific guidance on Florida was already provided to a similar audience on Monday.
Thank you. And sort of in the same vein, are there restrictions on student activities such as outreach and so forth, which are designed to increase diversity in science, to bring in people who wouldn't normally be part of the science community?
This is an excellent question, and the answer is pretty straightforward. There are no restrictions, to my knowledge, on student participation or student activities in these laws. In the two DEI bans, student participation and student activities are specifically exempted from the restrictions. The one exception is that there may be a couple of educational gag orders that restrict, for instance, the one in Mississippi, that restrict a division or classification by race of students, which means that a student group explicitly dedicated to a particular minority group or minority identity could potentially face a loss of school recognition or school funding, but even then it wouldn't be banned. And in practice, these are gag order laws, have been on the books for over a year. I haven't seen a single instance of a student group like this actually losing recognition or funding. So I would proceed as normal.
And most of these student clubs actually have faculty members as their advisors. And are these faculty members targets?
I have not seen a single instance of a faculty member being targeted for advising a student club or even attempted to be targeted. So I wouldn't worry about that.
Well, that at least is a little bit of good news here. Other people are wondering how these gag orders and so forth impact high school science teachers.
So it's a good question. I mean, I think high school science teachers are potentially enjoined from discussing certain topics under the gag order laws, and there may also be district level policies that enjoin them from certain DEI practices. But again, I would emphasize that if you aren't sure whether you're allowed to say something, then you're allowed to say it, because the only way if I were in your shoes, and this really is whether or not I had family issues on the line or I really needed to keep my job, I would not feel that I needed to avoid a topic unless I was specifically directed to avoid that topic by a senior administrator at my institution. I would not avoid it on my own. You can always say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, because it's true. You didn't know, or it's unclear what these laws ban or how they'll be enforced. So I would say, if you have not received specific guidance limiting something, go ahead and teach it.
I like that. So a question has come in about, again, another question about Florida and Texas. And so, as you know, some of the federal funding agencies are sort of putting DEI requirements on your grants. You have to show the broader impacts of your science and the way your grant is going to build the science community. Do these bills prohibit faculty from addressing those DEI requirements in federal funding applications?
So the bills outside of Texas and Florida definitely do not. This is, however, very concerning in Texas and Florida, because in both states, this issue was raised during the bill drafting process, and the decision was made specifically by legislators not to exempt federal grant making process from these restrictions. In Texas, in fact, the bill was amended to exempt it and then re-amended at the last minute to not exempt it. So, the lawmakers have weighed in that they do not want these grants to be exempted. Many of the arguments, particularly in Texas, were being made by scientists, arguing that they would have limited access to federal money without being able to meet these requirements. So I would say in these cases, work with your institution, see if there is a workaround that they will support that can be used. But it is a very concerning development.
Yeah, seriously. So I don't know how much you know about physicists, but they tend not to look outside their community as much as they could. So I love this next question that came in. Are there other disciplines who are organizing around anti-DEI laws that are models for physicists to emulate? What can we learn from others?
There are, I have worked, it is a very interesting question. I'll tell a little story around it. I have worked for the last 2 years that I've been working on this issue, primarily with disciplines in the humanities and social sciences. And I think the sense was that the original round of bills, the educational gag orders, had more of an effect on those disciplines than they did on the hard sciences. And since the anti-DEI bills have come out, I have been flooded with requests from institutions in the hard sciences, organizations in the hard sciences, who are very concerned about these bills. And the good news is, yes, there are models for responding to this that we've developed over the last couple of years. We have a messaging guide. I'll put the link in the chat in the moment, which doesn't help the folks on the Zoom call, but be available around these bills, developed by PEN America and the American Council on Education, that sort of describes successful messages for how to respond to this. There's a lot of activity going on at organizations such as the American Historical Association and the American Sociological Association. Organizations in a variety of disciplines have been working on this, as have organizations at the administrative level, organizations that represent presidents, provosts, and other senior administrators. So there is a large community available at this point that has organized on this issue. It's very inspiring to me, because 2 years ago it didn't exist. 2 years ago there were just a couple of groups working on this, but now that's definitely not true.
So we will at APS commit to getting the word out about what some of those groups are. I think it's really important, because I do think we're all stronger together than we are apart. So there's a field of physics called physics education research, where you actually use the techniques of physics and science to do education, to do research in how to teach physics effectively, as opposed to the way we were taught. And there's a question that came in from somebody who's hoping to do a DEI-related postdoc in this area of physics education research. And this person wants to know the extent to which they should consider the political landscape of the states when they're looking for positions.
Oh, it's a good question. Research related to DEI was specifically exempted from the Texas bill. So it should not, in theory, in any direct way, affect education in Texas at the postgraduate or postdoctoral level. Of course, there will be effects on what kind of programs can be put on at the institution, but the research itself should not be impacted. I wouldn't expect those programs to disappear in a research formula. It's less clear in the Florida law, but it's pretty clear in the Texas one. And of course, the other states, again, I wouldn't worry about that. There is, I will say this as a general statement, there is a kind of unfortunate sorting that is going on right now between blue states and red states around education. I mean, I remember when I was teaching, all of my teaching, I've taught in several institutions, taught U.S. history, and every single one has been in a red state. When I was teaching in rural Utah, and I taught about Reconstruction, U.S. history, Reconstruction, I had a student come up to me and say, well, I spent some time earlier in college in Louisiana. Would I learn the same thing at LSU? And I said, yes, without question or hesitation. And, I think that there is a sort of movement afoot to change that, to make a red state education and blue state education. And, people have to decide how they want to fall within that. I think it's a sort of, good and noble goal to try to buck that trend and make sure that there are diverse voices everywhere, no matter what the state government thinks. There's also a question of personal comfort and safety, really. So that's an individual decision, but that is the context in which it's being made.
Do you know of any STEM faculty or instructors who've been actually charged with violating anti-DEI laws?
Not a single one, and that's important, because I'm glad somebody asked that, because again, my experience as a faculty member is that faculty members tend to be very nervous about things, even when it is or isn't warranted. It certainly is warranted here to be nervous, but we want to make sure that we are addressing the threat, as appropriately as possible. There is not a single instance of a STEM faculty member who has faced any restrictions under these laws as of yet. That certainly applies to the educational gag orders, which have been enforced in higher education in some states for 2 years now. The DEI bans are more of an open question, but again, they only apply in 2 states.
May I interject here, Jonathan?
Sure.
There's a question that goes along with that, and that is, are you aware of people ending DEI programs because of fear of being charged under it?
So in the 2 states where these laws have been passed, we have seen basically the wholesale disbanding of DEI initiatives, and the approach has generally been at most schools to disband them formally and attempt to reintegrate parts of them into other aspects of the university, which, I think both of those may be questionable decisions in some ways. I think it's unclear. The laws are pretty clearly worded that they apply to the work and not just to the term. But that said, they also are not as clearly worded as they could be. So that's what we've seen in Texas and Florida thus far. We've also seen a number of boards of trustees making the decision to get out in front of this by preemptively banning DEI programs and offices, even in states where these laws have not passed yet, or maybe even be unlikely to pass. I would say, as I sort of watch the administrative censorship building here, it's really been more significant probably for these laws than it has been for the CRT bans, because with the CRT bans, there was a general sense in most corners of higher education that, in fact, teachers do have academic freedom to teach their course material without interference. We saw some violations, but not widespread. Here, because this applies to staff and to offices primarily, there has been much less restraint, and it's very concerning to see that lack of restraint appearing at universities.
You comment a little bit about the effect of these anti-DEI laws on historically Black colleges and universities or minority serving institutions?
Yes. So as your listeners know, many minority serving institutions and HBCUs are private, and thus far there has been no effect. There have been a couple of laws and bills that have attempted to affect private institutions. The only one that went into effect, the Stop Woke Act in Florida, that part of the bill has been stayed. But many are also public institutions, and it's worth noting that in the Purnell v. Lamb case, one of the 2 cases that resulted in staying the higher ed portion of the Stop Woke Act in Florida, the lead plaintiff, Leroy Purnell, is a law school dean at an HBCU, a public HBCU, Florida A&M University. So these laws, they really do have a significant effect on HBCUs that are public. And minority serving institutions more generally that are public. It's quite tragic. Some of the restrictions. The restrictions in some states on mentioning CRT in a classroom anywhere in the state that apply to public HBCUs, restrictions on DEI programs in minority serving institutions. They apply the same there as they apply anywhere else. So it is a particularly tragic component of these bills and laws that we've seen so far.
What about industries who are trying to increase participation and diversity of their workforces? Are they allowed to do have such efforts? So
again, there have been no laws that, frankly, I'm not an attorney, but I think it would be pretty obviously unconstitutional to try to attempt to restrict a private business in terms of what programming it can offer and initiatives it can offer. There have been some attempts. The Stop Woke Act had a provision like that, which has been stayed. And there are a lot of rumblings at the moment around potential restrictions. People promoting restrictions. There are some lawsuits that are attempting to restrict, differential hiring practices that favor minority applicants in particular. But those laws are based on the precedent of the Students for Fair Admissions decision relating to admissions, and there's an attempt to expand that to hiring practices. It does not really apply, and I'm not sure under what conditions it could apply to diversity programming that's offered, or to the general idea that corporations and businesses are interested in recruiting students who have cultural competency and who have an understanding of the diverse peoples with whom they work. In fact, one of the arguments that is strongest against these laws is that they hobble higher education in certain states in terms of its global competitiveness, right? Corporations may stop recruiting students in particular states from particular states if they feel that those states have not provided those students with an adequate education.
We got more questions coming, but I just first want to thank you, because I just keep shooting these questions at you and you keep answering them, and that's terrific. So I really appreciate it. So a question came in. It basically says, and I resonate with this question, that institutions, universities are famously risk averse, and so when you sort of say, let's walk up to the line, faculty might not feel supported. And so the question really is, are there places to go where individuals can get legal advice on what they can and can't do within their programs and collaborations that's not at their university?
This is a really good question. And I should clarify that the line that I'm encouraging faculty to walk up to is the line set by their administration, not the line necessarily set by the law. Now, in many cases, the administration has not set a line, or has just said, our guidance on this law is, here is the exact text of the law. That is our guidance. We see that a lot. We also see good guidances. We've seen a couple of really bad guidances, but overall, the guidances have been fairly strong, particularly on the CRT bills, less so on the DEI bans. But we're not encouraging faculty to do something that will get them in trouble with their administrations at each level of enforcement, from the legislature to the enforcement agency at the state level, to the universities, administrators, to the faculty members themselves. There is a risk of magnifying the problem and chilling, having the chilling effect ban even more content across the spectrum. We're suggesting that you not contribute to the problem, that if an administrator tells you don't teach X, Y, and Z, don't teach X, Y, and Z, but also don't restrict yourself from teaching A, B, and C because you think the administrator might not like it, right? Wait until you're told not to do it before you do it. That doesn't mean you have to sort of tell the administrator. I think you should tell the administrator that you have a different interpretation of the law, but ultimately, if I were that faculty member, I would follow the administrator's guidance. But to the broader question, yes, ideally your general counsel is the person who's going to give you guidance on this. In practice, many general counsels have done so and have done so well, and others have not. So I would start with the university leadership and let them show you that they're not going to be helpful, because in many cases, frankly, they are helpful. And it's worth trying. Beyond that, the AAUP always provides excellent guidance for faculty members. Faculty unions of other types can provide that guidance. We are not a legal operation, so we can't provide specific guidance in individual situations, but they can. AAUP being the American Association of University Professors, to be clear.
You provided some pretty interesting statistics from national polls. Do you have actually any information as to how the attitudes towards DEI and so forth are distributed both geographically, but also by other subclasses, by age cohort, race, sex, whatever? Do you have any broken down information?
So for the DEI bans, for views on DEI in general, there has only been one poll. So we don't really have any of that. And again, that I would describe that poll as suggestive rather than determinative, being that it's a single poll. For some of the other issues that are related, though, we do have more detail. For instance, there was a poll that the American Historical Association and Fairleigh Dickinson University did on that question of teaching the honest history of slavery and racism, even if it makes students uncomfortable. That poll found that 76% of Americans overall, including 74% of Republicans, agree with that statement, and found majorities of people from every demographic group agreeing with that statement, broken down by age, by race, and by gender. We also have more detailed data on polls around book bans, which is useful, I think, as a sort of comparison point. It's not the same issue, and book bans, generally speaking, are the least popular of these issues. You get over 80% of Americans think they're unacceptable at any time, so it's a very significant split. But we have seen those numbers borne out to some extent in surprising places. So, for instance, there was a poll done in Tennessee that asked the question about school book bans. It found 68% of all Tennesseans oppose school book bans, so less than the national average, but still a huge majority. And then it broke that down by urban versus rural. It found that even in rural Tennessee, 64% of all Tennesseans oppose book bans. So the sense that we have is that it is fairly difficult to isolate a group of people who think that these things are a good idea, certainly not overwhelmingly so.
Nobody wants the government telling them what to do, I think.
Exactly, and that's the frame, yes.
Let me end with just two more questions, and before I pass the floor over to Beth. But so we have a lot of people who really want to take some action, and so are there any resources that you can point them to, which can give them some talking points or other ideas that you developed on your "What Can I Do" slide?
So the PEN America ACE resource guide that I put linked to in the chat, and you can find it online, American Council on Education PEN America resource guide on academic freedom is what it's called. This provides some of the best poll tested messaging that we've seen on this issue. We really strongly recommend this. We also have on our website pen.org some of the facts and figures around bans and where they appear and what impact they have. We've produced two major reports on this topic: educational gag orders and America's censored classrooms. We have another one coming out next month, rounding up the 2023 legislative sessions. And so I think that's a good starting place, but a number of other organizations have strong resources. I certainly think your disciplinary associations are a good place to start as well.
So that's a beautiful segue into my final question. I mean, are there any signs yet that this sort of anti-DEI legislation could encourage similar gag orders on other content, for example, discussing climate change in the classroom?
It's a good question. I have not heard chatter around this, with the exception of restrictions on discussing abortion and contraception, some of which have, but that's not exactly chatter so much as it is something that's happened as bills have, trigger laws have gone into effect after the Dobbs decision. Beyond that, in STEM fields, I haven't heard anything specific like that. I wouldn't put it past the folks who are dreaming up this legislation, but it's, I don't want to raise alarm unnecessarily either.
Well, gosh, thank you so much for fielding all those questions with such grace and good humor, because they were coming fast and furious. Let me turn the floor over to Beth.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Young. That was an incredibly, very helpful. I've been watching the Q&A, and I've seen a number of individuals say that they really appreciate the information that you've shared with us today. I know that everybody feels better informed about these policies, and I'm confident that we can continue our society's work towards diversifying the physics community. I really appreciate your time and expertise, and I know after seeing all these comments that people appreciated it. Those that were attending today appreciated it also.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. I want to also say to our members, thank you for taking time to come and learn more about the policies. And we know that many of you are seeking pathways for action when it comes to the legislation like this. And I also want to take the opportunity to let you know that APS, AAPT, NSBP, and with the addition of Optica are working on the next steps. We recently received funding from the American Institute of Physics to pursue advocacy at the federal level to help prevent this type of legislation from spreading at the national level. There will be opportunities for you and other members of our organizations to participate in a grassroots advocacy action over the next 2 years. And so keep your eyes open for communications from one of the societies here today and Optica. I want to thank you again for your time, and I hope that you'll give our speaker, Dr. Young, one more round of virtual appreciation for sharing his expertise with us before we sign off. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.